Fertility, education, the climate crisis. Just some of the issues countries are grappling with on this, the United Nations World Population Day. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. World Population Day was first observed in 1987 by the United Nations when the world's population hit 5 billion. It's a chance to discuss the challenges and injustices impacting women and girls who make up 49.7% of the global population. With 8 billion people now living on the planet, natural resources are being strained and catastrophic climate events are forcing people to leave their homes. Since 2007, more people have lived in cities than rural areas, and by 2050, the United Nations estimates that 66% of the world's population will be living in cities. Joining us now from New York is Maimunah Mohd Sharif. She's the Executive Director of the United Nations Human Settlements Program, known as UN Habitat. Thanks so much for joining us. I know that this year's UN World Population Day is titled Unleashing the Power of Gender Equality, Uplifting the Voices of Women and Girls to Unlock Our World's Infinite Possibilities. I know gender issues have been very important to you, dating back to 2011 when you were mayor of Penang Island in Malaysia. Can you talk to us about how, the importance of how empowering women translates to your program you're running there at the UN today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for having me in this program. As you said, that is women's challenges and issues very close to my heart because I was the first woman mayor in a city called Seberang Perai after 19 male mayors. So it's very, very important and very close to my heart. And regarding your question, how can we empowering women, that is translate to our program? If you see that is the SDG 11, the Sustainable Development Goal 11 is to make cities, communities more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we have 4 targets for that. So if you look into the SDG 11, it's mentioned about inclusive. I think this is inclusive, which include women, girls, boys, and people with this ability. And equity and inclusivity are the 2 main principles actually that serve UN Habitat as a foundation for our work. And we try to ensure a fair and inclusive approach, and we always talk about leaving no one and no place behind. And I just want to share with you one of our flagship programs titled Inclusive, Vibrant Neighborhood and Communities. I think this focus on how we can reduce the spatial inequality and also the poverty. And it works to transform urban areas into a connected, dynamic, and diverse and vibrant neighborhood. While doing so, definitely we consider the needs of women and girls. And I always say, I'm an urban planner. I always say that if the city plan for women is a city and safe, it's also safe for everyone. And how do we do it? We have to look into I believe in engagement, and we call it a participatory planning. And this is an approach that we are continuing in UN Habitat. We also call it a people process. So we need to meet with the communities, with the women, in order to align with the leave no one behind. So for example, in our project in Egypt, we include women in one of our 4 our project and assess their needs while planning for work to upgrade the bus transit system, for example. And I also always talk about with the need to involve women in city planning. This is to make our urban areas better. And I would like to share with you in UN Habitat, we have a tool, we call it Her City Tools, which is an app which support urban development from a girls' or women's perspective. This also will guide the urban actors like the mayors, the engineers, the architects, and the planners to implement projects through step-by-step methodology and providing an open and digitally accessible platform for all.
Okay, well,
So
let me jump in here for just a minute, if you don't mind. You know, you talked about being an urban planner, about being women involved. I was watching a speech of yours when you said you first got into leadership. One of the reporters came up and asked you, you know, are you going to cry when you have a problem? Basically indicating that, you know, how do women deal with things? But women do bring a different approach. And you know, if you're to look at his question, I guess it could be, oh, they're the weaker sex. They don't know how to deal with it. They're too emotional. But they do bring skills to this process. And I know you know that. And so I want you to talk about that. But also, are you still up against it, where you still have kind of these boneheaded men out there kind of approaching it like, oh, can women really do this sort of work?
Yeah, I always say that is I think you are following me very close. I was asked by a reporter that women's leaders, is there any time that you will, when you face challenges, you will cry? I believe in myself, and I said that I will cry when the people praise me, but I won't cry when I face challenges. So that is the principle that I'm holding until up to now. I think because we really need a strong leadership to bring forward the issues and the challenges faced by women in cities. Because as you know, that is 50% of the global population is women. So if we don't take the opportunity to optimize the women's energy and also the talent, it's a waste. So this is very, very important, and at the same time, for planning and management in the cities, and we need to create a room for women leadership. And during the Habitat Assembly last month, we launched the Women-led Cities program. We would like to see more women in the city management, not only as a mayors, but also in business, in community. Because at the moment now, it's only 5% of the cities is led by women, and on only 2%, if I'm not mistaken, all the Fortune 500 companies led by women. So we need to encourage women. We need to be at the table. And I used to say that if we are not at the table, we will be on the menu. So we need to work harder.
Yeah, really good point there. You know, the sustainable goals for member countries, they're hoping, the UN, hoping that they'll reach it by 2030. Of course, number 11, I think you touched on the sustainable development, making cities and human settlements safe, resilient, and sustainable. What are some of the biggest challenges you see out there on the landscape in developing countries, and specifically the African continent?
Yeah, in the African continent, before I share with you the challenges, I think what is this Africa and Asia, there are two continents which is the rate of urbanizations are the highest. So one of the challenges that I will see is that housing is the biggest challenge. This is also in line with our finding in the report, the indicators 11.1, where the indicators of SDG 11.1 is to ensure access for all and adequate housing and affordable. So because at the moment now, 2.8 billion people are estimated to be affected by different form of housing inadequacy. And COVID-19 pandemic is an ongoing conflict had made the situation worse. So we are seeing a growth in the number of people living in informal settlement. Now, Mike, is 1.1 billion people, or at least 318 million people, staying unhoused or even homeless. So I think the biggest challenge in Africa and Southern Asia, housing is a problem. When you talk about housing, definitely it will link to the basic services like water, electricity, sanitation, job, employment. So I think this is very, very crucial that we have to put more priority on adequate and affordable housing. So I think and also to house these 2.8 billion people who are affected by housing inadequacy.
Right.
Over to you.
You know, in our business, we tend to focus a lot on the negative, but there are silver linings out there, as you well know. And I think China would come to the fore when you think about this. Country's building a lot of smart cities, affordable housing. We've got about 65% of the populace in China now living in cities. What are some of the areas that you see in China that maybe could be duplicated in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I have a chance to visit China several times over the past years when I was a mayor and also as an ED. So when I was there, I'm very impressed with the achievement of China, especially on affordable housing and how they do the people-centered approach to urban planning. At the same time, it's also how they alleviate the problem of poverty. I think a lot of good practices should be shared, and also with China, with maybe with Asia, other part of Asia, and also in Africa, especially in how they eradicate the extreme poverty in order to achieve the SDG. And China is also active in the climate change issues, and they are working on the transition towards green and sustainable development and green infrastructure development of wind power and renewable energy. I think a lot of expertise and knowledge in urban development can be shared with countries in Asia and Africa, which face the similar problem. But of course, China is also not immune to the challenges of rapid urbanization. They still need to do a lot to manage and maintain the human settlement, like traffic congestions, environmental protections, and also the gap between urban and rural. So, but overall, I think they are also having the, if I'm not mistaken, through my reading, they're also having the challenges on aging population are still a problem in China. So, well, overall, that we need to work together to look at the best practices and to be shared and to learn, and also to replicate and to scale up and spread out all these new practices.
Maimunah, Mohd, Sharif, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know it's a busy day for you, so we're definitely delighted to chat with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for having me. Thank you.
For more on the UN's World Population Day, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Memphis, Tennessee is Jennifer Shuba. She's a scholar with the Wilson Center and author of 8 Billion and Counting, How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. From New York, Bei Wu is the Dean's Professor in Global Health and Vice Dean for Research at New York University's Rory Myers College of Nursing, and Kathleen Mogelgaard is the president and CEO of the Population Institute here in Washington, D.C. Kathleen, I'm going to start with you because you are out with this really interesting report, some key findings in it. I'm just going to lightly touch on them. Maybe you can expand on them. Population growth spiking in countries that are highly vulnerable to human-caused climate change. Another finding and another key takeaway, gender inequity is leaving many women and girls vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Can you just expand on those two findings and some of the other findings you came across?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Mike. And I'm really glad that you and your team wanted to tackle these topics today. The report that the Population Institute released today included an analysis of population trends and other indicators in the 80 countries that are deemed most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change. And what our analysis revealed is that the average population growth rate in those countries is significantly higher than the global average. And as you mentioned, gender inequity, including access to reproductive health care and family planning services, those indicators tend to be lower in those countries that are most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change as well. And in the report, we outline the ways in which these factors, both the rapid population growth and the persistent gender inequity, are things that make coping with the climate change challenge more difficult today and over the long term.
And Kathleen, one of the things that I find interesting, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, is I think if you were to go and talk to somebody on the street and say, you know, we got these problems out there. We've got the problem of poverty and population and gender inequality and climate change, they would think, oh, they're all separate silos. There's no interconnectivity. And yet I think reading through this, there is an interrelationship, isn't there?
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important moment on World Population Day to think about the way these trends interact with one another, and in particular, the way that we can devise responses that are holistic and integrated and think about these things in a connected way. And in our report, we showcase these really hopeful stories of initiatives from around the world in 5 different countries that are implementing integrated holistic strategies that tackle these challenges of gender inequity, a lack of access to voluntary family planning and reproductive health care, and climate change resilience in an integrated way. And we really do believe that this is a terrific opportunity to think about ways to more deeply invest in these holistic strategies to put ourselves on a path toward a more just and sustainable future.
And Jennifer, your book, you look at this explosion in population, but you also arrive at a really interesting story, and I think maybe you can talk about this. It's not just population growth, it's differential growth. I mean, we're seeing an explosion of growth in some areas of the world and a shrinkage in other spots.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for us to focus actually on the fact that both exist at the same time in the world. Kathleen and the Population Institute's report is very important to showcase how problems that we faced last century in many parts of the world today, they're still present. But those parts of the world that were experiencing that are today facing an entirely new challenge, which is to think about how overall population size is shrinking. And I think what that calls attention to is the need to keep focusing on how we are consuming resources worldwide, that we have to go beyond just thinking about population numbers and things like a population explosion and think about how it has really slowed down in a lot of parts of the world. And yet we still have issues with environmental stress.
And speaking of slowdowns, Maimunah, I'd like to turn to you now because obviously China has a different problem in that sense. India surpassing it now as the most populous nation in the world. China's population has been on the decline even when the country decided to move away from the one-child policy in 2015 and start encouraging families to have more children, as many as 3. We're still seeing a problem there, aren't we?
Yes, right. So certainly that many young people, you certainly see a low rate of marriage, low rate of fertility, despite all the policy encouragement for having more children.
And I was in China, obviously, before the pandemic. I was interviewing a CEO, a woman who was hard charging, doing very well, and she was like, I'm putting it off, and I may not have kids. And as you pointed out, I think it was China's Ministry of Civil Affairs in June, they say the number of marriage registrations at the lowest in 37 years. As the government looks at this, how do you address this problem if you're creating inducements to try and get people to have children, and yet they're not really responding?
Well, I think this is certainly that many kind of factors put into this equation. Think about this, that more and more people, particularly women, that they are getting married in much later stage. Women are become more economically independent, and certainly you can increase in very high cost of raising children, as well as actually it's a cultural change. Think about that traditionally it's a very much a children-centered kind of family structure. The more and more people, actually young people, think about self-centered. So this is a cultural change, and also for many utility reasons that people don't want to kind of have children. So this is something that for the policy need to not only giving kind of cash incentive for people having more children, but also a whole kind of social kind of and the infrastructure building to help people to provide more free services for the daycare services, and also encourage women to think about women's caregiving tradition has been, it's on their own kind of cost. But this is think about from society point of view to acknowledge women's caregiving responsibility is actually generate revenue to some extent. So that's what, so that's a kind of whole the structure and the policies that to encourage more children in that sense. It's not just kind of a cash incentive in that sense.
Interesting. Well, Kathleen, the UN wants to unleash the power of gender equality, but if you look at the trends, more than 40% of women around the world cannot make decisions on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And here in the U.S., you're seeing a number of states moving in the other direction after the Dobbs decision. I mean, more and more restrictive legislation passing. Iowa now looking at also passing more restrictive legislation when it comes to women's rights in that regard. Is this troubling? Do you see it going in the wrong direction?
I find it very troubling. I think that we are definitely going in the wrong direction on things like reproductive autonomy, bodily autonomy in many places of the world. And I think that we are not doing what we need to do for women, for gender diverse people, in really thinking about how we support people in their rights and opportunities in every aspect of their lives. And unfortunately, we're seeing this really heavily with programs around voluntary family planning and reproductive health care. Even though we have the largest generation in history globally entering their reproductive years, we've seen stagnation in funding for these programs that would enable people to have this really vital, fundamental agency in their lives to determine whether, when, how often, and with whom to become a parent. So I do think it's very troubling to see this rollback in rights, to see the rollback in investments. And the more that we can do to help illustrate the ways in which these investments are fundamental for people's individual human rights and the ways that they connect to other global issues that are creating challenges for us and for sustainability, hopefully we'll be able to move in a better direction with greater support for these kinds of very fundamental services and rights for women and girls around the world.
Jennifer, you can find just about anything on YouTube, and I was watching a video of you in Texas about 6 months ago. Really fascinating conversation about demographics, but you talked about bureaucrats in the bedroom, you know, this whole policy, politics, population. Talk to us about it. Is it effective? Because I mean, it wasn't just, you weren't just talking about the United States, you're talking about other countries trying to basically put their finger on the scale, and sometimes it doesn't work.
Absolutely. It doesn't work. Mostly it doesn't work. And in fact, if you want to make it work, you have to do some really nasty things. And so I think that is the lesson that we all need to start shifting our mindset towards when we think about population, because I have a big fear, building on what you just asked about reproductive rights. I have a big fear that coercion to induce more births is just around the corner for a lot more countries these days, because now we've hit this point that even though world population is still growing, over 2/3 of our countries in the world actually have what's called below replacement fertility, meaning below the level needed to replace who's already born. And a greater number of those countries than ever are non-democracies. And I think there is a worry that there are not checks and balances on how countries might approach the goal of raising fertility. So I say, let's not have a goal of raising fertility at all. Instead, think about how to give people the best lives out there. And then the byproduct of that may be that people do have more children. But I think what we have learned from looking at the past is that when you try to make raising fertility the center of your policy, the goal, you spend a lot of money, these cash bonuses we were talking about earlier, to not actually see any better life for anyone and not see higher fertility. So we need a different approach.
Well, Jennifer, I also read an opinion piece of yours that was out a few years back, which I thought was fascinating. You were looking at hotspots, places where terrorism is kind of raising its ugly head, places like Somalia, and instead of a military solution, I think you pointed out you can make the world safer one condom at a time. Talk to us about that.
I do tend to have some cheeky little titles in my op-eds for anybody who goes digging. And yes, I think it's about the idea that, you know, I come from a national security background, but sometimes the best tool for peace is not actually found in the military toolbox. And thinking again about meeting people's basic needs can be really effective. When we think about high population growth, and again, this dovetails with looking at those places in the world that are really suffering from climate change. Countries in the world that have rapid population growth and high fertility are some of the most vulnerable to civil conflict. And so if you want to have world peace, you should think about how to help these populations, people to have voluntary family planning and other types of health care, of course, to have their basic needs met. Because what we know is that eventually fertility rates do come down. In fact, they've come down really quickly over the last half century or so. And those countries with higher median ages, meaning older populations, are less likely to have outbreaks of conflict. So it's a long way to go from point A to point Z, but we do know that from studying the past, when we have countries with lower fertility, they are less likely to see outbreaks of civil conflict.
And Bei Wu, our earlier guest, was talking about China and smart cities and what we're seeing there. But she pointed out that there is a gap between urban and rural. Are there some things that you see in China that could be translated in other countries to try and deal with climate change? And what do you see about the gap there between urban and rural?
Yeah, right. There's a significant differences in urban and rural, particularly in terms of population-wise. That certainly, as our previous guest already said, that more than 60% of a population, there's a rapid urbanization in China for the past 20 or 30 years. So there's more than 60% of populations are residing in urban areas. But also you can see the kind of population migration. There's a huge number, more than 200 million population young people that moved from rural areas to urban areas, so left older adults behind. So you can see this, the proportion of aging population is such a difference between urban and rural areas. In urban areas, it's close to like 15% of the population as older adults versus those in rural areas is a way more higher proportion of older adults in rural areas. But on the other hand, there's a significant kind of disparities in terms of availability of services, and particularly for long-term care services for older adults in these two kind of areas. So I don't know whether you want me to go into more kind of long-term care facilities and the services in that sense.
Kathleen, in the conclusion of your report, you talked about there were interventions that you found in some countries like Guatemala and the Philippines. And we don't have much time, maybe 45 seconds. Are there some that you would point to that give you a good reason to feel pretty good about the future as we look at some of these problems that are out there percolating?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Every effort that we showcased in that report gives me hope for the future. You mentioned the case in Guatemala, where there's a conservation organization called Funda Eco that is doing these RED Plus projects, reforestation to capture carbon, that brings in resources that they are using for their Healthy and Empowered Women and Girls program, because they see these as so interconnected, that investing in a climate resilient future is one in which we should also be investing in the health and rights of women and girls. I'm also really moved by the work that's happening in Niger, which is one of the places in the world with the most rapid population growth. Niger is the most climate vulnerable nation in the world, and yet there are loads and loads of young people who see these issues as connected, who are advocating for local budgets for voluntary family planning, reproductive health, and gender equity. And I think those are the kinds of movements that are so inspiring to see as this generation is coming up and understanding how these issues are connected one to the other.
Well, I want to thank all of you for giving us a lot to think about and some great perspectives, and also ending on a hopeful note. So thank you so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.